listener production.
Hi, Bension here. Just before we get into this afternoon's topic, I wanted to let you know that this episode deals with domestic abuse. 25 years ago, a group of British women decided to strip to be photographed for a calendar to raise money for charity. But these weren't models or sports stars, they were ordinary women from a small town in Yorkshire.
We're planning a calendar for John.
And proposing on it.
And that's about it, really.
Naked.
They were photographed with cleverly positioned props, so the photographs weren't explicit, even though they were naked. The calendars were a massive hit, selling hundreds of thousands of copies and eventually becoming the subject of a feature film starring Helen Mirren. The idea was to honour one of their husbands, John, who'd been diagnosed with cancer. The concept has since been adopted by a string of campaigns, including Australia's Matildas soccer team, who famously chose to strip to sell calendars in an effort to make enough money to make ends meet, while their male counterparts enjoyed the riches of highly paid contracts and sponsor deals. So fast forward to 2024, and 14 high-profile Australian women have decided to strip to raise awareness of domestic abuse, to keep the conversation going and to try and shift the needle on Australia's attitude to the crisis. And our very own Antoinette Lattouf is one of the women who will feature in the calendar. Hey, Antoinette. Firstly, why did you decide to join this campaign?
Yeah, well, sex historian Esme Louise James, who was actually on the Weekend Briefing a few episodes ago, she reached out and asked me to be involved. And she is famous for her online series, Kinky History. And so if you haven't checked out that Weekend Briefing, I would point our listeners to check that out. So one thing, Bension, you and I discuss it with the briefing team almost on a weekly basis, is how do we keep covering domestic violence? How do we do it differently? How do we keep the conversation going without waiting until another woman is murdered, which unfortunately is inevitably the case in Australia? So this was an opportunity to keep that conversation going, to keep people informed and to try and raise some money. And so when that opportunity presented itself, and also being a fan of what the Calendar Girls did in the UK and also the film Offshoot, I was like, well, here's an opportunity. Here's something I'm passionate about. So I decided to get involved.
Are you someone who has experience of domestic abuse?
Yeah, look, it's not something I talk about often, but I did grow up surrounded by domestic violence and experiencing it and witnessing it. I also knew that I brought a different lens to this conversation in terms of how domestic violence impacts migrant and refugee communities. One of the first questions I asked when I was invited to be involved is, who else is in this? Who else is going to be part of this campaign? Because we know that domestic violence doesn't discriminate, but we also know that unfortunately what gets the national attention too often is when a pretty white woman is killed or the subject of domestic violence, not when it's a First Nations woman or not when it's a woman with disability. And what's beautiful about this calendar and this campaign is that the 14 women are a real cross-section of Australian society.
Were you nervous getting involved? It's quite a thing to get one's kid off.
Yeah, and look,
public.
I think it's important to point out that there are various levels of nudity in this campaign. Some of the models themselves have experienced domestic violence as well and sexual violence. So this wasn't a one-size-fits-all. It was what makes the model, and I use that term loosely, the model most comfortable. And this includes actors and influencers and Animal Justice MP Georgie Purcell. For me, I wore an oversized men's blazer and not much else, whereas some others went full nude with some carefully placed props. And I think it's important to honour that women are different and women have different relationships with their bodies and the public. And also I grew up in a really conservative family and a conservative culture. And even doing this, when I was asked, I did hesitate. But I pushed on because I realised that many of those cultural expectations around a woman's body are rooted in misogyny and often a gross imbalance of power. And it's this power that is often why men feel entitled to control women's bodies all their lives.
The calendar is also marked with important dates throughout the year, dates like the AFL Grand Final and State of Origin. This is about reminding Australians that there's a spike in domestic violence when those kinds of events happen. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, what this calendar does is it reminds people to write to your MP, donate to causes, support the movement in various ways. It also provides information as to when there are peaks in domestic violence, and that we do know that around major sporting events like the AFL Grand Final, Melbourne Cup Day, domestic violence incidence spikes. It's a combination of more alcohol use, people maybe being angry because their bets didn't turn out the way they wanted to, and around even state of origin days, that's coming up on June 26, that domestic violence rates can increase by around 40% at that time. We think it's really important that people are reminded of that, even for their own safety, or to check in on those around them who might be vulnerable.
Are there also resources in the calendar, I suppose, for someone who might be in that situation that they can get help?
There are resources for what you can do if you're in that situation or if you're trying to support a person in that situation. The calendar also highlights intersectionality when it comes to gender-based violence, including awareness for people with disability, transgender, neurodiverse people, First Nations people, people of colour. As we know, the more intersecting identities one has, it can be harder to access services or harder to be believed as a victim of domestic violence. And so, this is just one little thing that people can do. The calendar costs $40, and the reason it costs that, and all proceeds go to Give It, which supports women and children escaping domestic violence to access necessary basics like clothing and a mattress and things like that. It was priced at $40 because 40 women have been killed so far this year. And that's an increase from this time last year.
We're all privileged to have a platform like this. I imagine that was part of the reason that you chose to be involved in the calendar.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm the only journo/commentator author in that cohort. We all come from different backgrounds and have social followings, and some are influencers, and some are academics, and some are actors, some are models. I think having a journo involved matters because words matter and the media framing of domestic violence matters. And for too long, it's been pretty problematic. Like you've seen those headlines or those opening pars in a story that go along the lines of, he was a nice guy who just happened to do a bad thing, or victim blaming. A woman left the husband, which sent him into a rage. Or we've even recently had a senior police officer say that describing domestic violence as a crime of passion. And it's like, no, it's a murderous crime. There's nothing passionate about stabbing your wife and your children to death. It's an enormous privilege to tell these stories, but it comes with a huge amount of responsibility. And too often, I think we're getting it wrong. We frame things as, he was just a nice guy who clicked, or what did she do, or what was she wearing, or what did she say, or was she having an affair? Even if she was having an affair, is that okay to take her life? And so that's why I wanted to be involved from that kind of media perspective.
Absolutely. And there is some inclusive and accurate communication and language that we can use. Is there some advice that you can provide on that? What do experts say we should talk about?
One thing we can try and do is think about passive language. Like, for example, Liz was abused. And it's like, well, no, Paul abused Liz. Let's talk about who the problem is. And that's not Liz, who is the victim. It's the perpetrator. For example, in this case, it's Paul. Using even sanitizing language like, domestic dispute. No, it's like it's domestic abuse or it's domestic violence. Let's talk about, this is not a dispute. A dispute sounds like two people arguing over a car spot. And I think there are little ways in which we can tweak our language, and not only as media professionals, but I even think when you're talking about it around the table with a bunch of mates, because if you're more likely to use language that centres the perpetrator as someone who just so happened to be having a bad day, or centres the victim as someone who's problematic, chances are, based on the stats, someone sitting around that table is at the receiving end of domestic violence, and they're less likely to come forward to you as a friend and a confidant to say, hey, this is what I'm experiencing, because they already feel prejudged or as as though it's going to be framed as though they're the problem.
It's often been a criticism made by the political right that there's too much sort of censorship of language in society. There's too much kind of looking down upon people for using certain words or getting certain words wrong. What's your response to that in this kind of context?
Yeah, I guess you've just got to balance it between like some people's hurt feelings over challenging them about language versus the mounting death toll of women. And I would argue the latter is more important. So if there are a whole bunch of dudes called Adam and Andrew in their 70s who are like, oh, this is just woke. I'm like, well, there are dead women. And so I'm okay with your feelings being a little bit hurt and you being a little bit protective of language if it means that we help in that part, help shift language as one way of addressing entrenched misogynistic and violent attitudes.
So have there been any comments, has there been any backlash against you or others who've been involved with this calendar?
Yeah, and it was expected. There's on the Let's Get Explicit Instagram page under some of the photographs, there have been some largely men, others kind of unidentifiable trolls who were saying, you know, why are you doing this? Why are you sexualizing your body? Isn't this part of the problem? And to that we respond, yes, we're attention seeking, because we need everybody's attention to stop gendered-based violence. And we're taking control of our bodies and saying enough is enough. And overall, we're trying to flip the narrative of what is considered explicit. It's not people using their own minds and bodies to their own volition. It's when that control is taken away. The Let's Get Explicit campaign essentially says that it's unacceptable for women to keep being killed. So we want to keep your attention, keep the conversation going without having to wait until the next headline and the next tragedy.
Absolutely. So the calendar launches this week?
Yes, it has launched this week. It's available for purchase online. It's a really useful resource. It costs $40. All proceeds go to Give It, and Give It helps women and children escaping domestic violence access basic things like clothing, shelter, a mattress, toiletries, things that if you've got to leave in the middle of the night to protect your life and the life of your children, that you don't have time to pack and gather the things that you'd need to start your next chapter.
Well, it's a very important cause, and congratulations on your involvement, Antoinette. And we're very happy to promote here on The Briefing.
Thanks so much, Bension.
That was our very own Antoinette Lattouf. To find out more and to order a calendar, go to letsgetexplicit.com. If this has raised any issues for you, or you just feel like you need to speak to someone, you can call 1-800-RESPECT, 1-800-737-732. That's the National Sexual Assault, Domestic and Family Violence Counselling Service. And if you're in immediate danger, of course, call 000. Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That's all for this afternoon. Just a reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep up to date with featured interviews we post in long form. Just search for Listener Newsroom. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.